In most countries, the lifting of martial law would be welcomed as a move towards greater freedom, fewer restrictions. In Thailand, however, 10 months of martial law has been replaced with something that appears to be even less democratic, and has left many people wondering whether the country's military has any intention of giving up power. Hello, I'm Teymoor Nabili. This is Between the Lines. Article 44 can be used as a fast cure to critical problems, or at least that was one of a number of reasons that was given by Thailand's Deputy Prime Minister on Tuesday to justify the fact that the military retains control even after the lifting of martial law. Now, in simple terms, Article 44 provides that the head of the National Council for Peace and Order has the power to, well, do pretty much anything he chooses. Moreover, under the new system, ordinary soldiers will have much more power to enforce their own judgments in the civilian realm, so long as they are deemed to be acting in the interests of peacekeeping and national security. Well, at today's gathering with the diplomatic community, the government argued that these measures are positive developments. But those claims have been met with considerable skepticism. So is Thailand still a de facto military dictatorship, or is the interim government truly planning a return to democracy? Well, joining me from Bangkok today, Dr. Panitan Watanayagon from Chulalongkorn University, and in London, Barapat Pariawong from the University of London. Gentlemen, thank you for being on the programme tonight. Dr. Panitan, let me begin with you because you're involved with what has been going on. You're an advisor to a senior military figure there. Let me put to you the claim that I made in the beginning of the programme. Many people are saying that this new system is actually more controlling than martial law was.
Well, I think that is slightly misunderstanding. Of course, the control is there since the coup last year, and this is not the first time. In the last few coups, there are certain articles in the interim constitution giving the military coup leader the absolute power to the administration, and this is almost the same. And what happened during the last few days is that that power is used to curb down the martial law practice. In other words, there is now the lifting of the martial law in place. There are 14 new regulations, and that regulations are now much lesser than martial law.
Well, as I say, you say they're much lesser than martial law. Many other people say they're much worse. The basic reality of the situation is that the head of the government, the head of the National Council for Peace and Order, let me read to you what some of the Article 44 says, and the translation may not be 100% accurate, but where the head of the National Council for Peace and Order is of the opinion that it's necessary for the benefit of reform in any field or for prevention or disruption or suppression of any act, blah, 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 he can do pretty much what he wants. And add to that, ordinary soldiers from lieutenant upwards and anybody that they give power to now have an incredible array of powers to act, to arrest, to involve themselves in the lives of civilians, and they get blanket clearance to do so from Article 44. Now, again, that does seem incredibly as if the military is utterly in control.
Well, the military is still in control, yes, but it's not true. Now you can bring officers into the court for the liability suit. That is not provided under martial law. Now you have to go to 3 courts instead of 1 court. That is not under the martial law. Now political rallies can be allowed if the NCPO granted the political rallies, and that is not under the martial law. And of course, you can plea bargain. For example, if you are called in for the report and you fail to do that, under the martial law, you'll be subject to the court martial. With the new regulations, you do not have to go to the military court in the same manners. You can plea bargain. In other words, what is now being introduced is not Article 44, Article 44 is introduced since a coup day last year. What is introduced in the last few days is 14 regulations to control the practice of the martial law.
But they all feed back to Article 44, which basically means that the head of the NCPO basically can grant carte blanche to everybody that acts in what he believes to be in the name of peacekeeping. Let's get a second opinion from our next guest, and let me ask you specifically about a couple of those things, Verapat Pariawong, that you have already written about, and that is the power granted to soldiers to act with impunity. Please address some of the comments made by Dr. Panitan.
Well, I think Dr. Panitan has made some correct points, saying that when you look from the junta's perspective, from the perspective of an authoritarian regime, there are some minor improvements. Of course, I welcome the fact that now civilians being tried in military court have the right to appeal, whereas under martial law there was no right to appeal. Some penalties are lessened, and of course they introduce a very interesting scheme of inviting people to attend a seminar or training camp for up to 7 days, as Ajahn Panitan described as plea bargaining. But at the end of the day, Teymoor, I think we come back to the basic fundamental point that there is no check and balance right now when it comes to the exercise of power by the military authoritarian regime. Let me use the exact word used by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Saeed Rad Al Hussein. He said that the lifting up of martial law is meaningless. And why? Simply because that the interpretation of Section 44 and Order Number 3/2558 basically says there is no judicial oversight when it comes to administrative exercise of these measures. Let's just say, for example, if one professor and 4 other students want to gather together in a classroom and talk about the dangers of authoritarian regime, and let's say a lieutenant walks in and say, well, this is against Order Number 3/2558. We have no judicial review over such action by the military regime. The same applies to people who want to protest peacefully on the streets. Of course, the order on the face of it says if it's approved by the junta, it can be done. But who knows whether the junta will approve eating of hamburgers or staging a peaceful play on the streets. We've seen that this current military regime has been not protecting the interests of the public, but protecting itself.
Dr. Panitan?
Well, I think yes, when you look at the full power of the military leaders, is still here. I think we are not a democratic country. Everybody knows that. And this is not the first time this kind of power is applied. This is 6 or 7 times already in the last 4 or 5 decades. On the ground, I think the interest is to keep peace, to make sure that different groups, if they are coming on the streets, do not provoke each other to create instability. And in fact, you have to look at the practice of even Article 44 since last year. The military leader has been very careful in not using that. Since they already have that power, they began to use that in different ways. For example, to solve the land problems in a very legalistic ways, not in the military way, not in the security way. They also began to use that to solve the crisis in the national aviation. So far, so good. But of course, Ajahn Virapat was quite correct in the sense that you need to install some sense of balance, some sense of check and balance in particular. In that regard, there are a lot more openness to listen to these concerns. And I think the military is willing to look into these. Lifting the martial law is one concern. Since the community, international community in particular, once the martial law is lifted, so the martial law is lifted, I think to make sure that stability continues, you need to have some kind of control, you need to have some kind of measures. The point is how to use that absolute power in a more acceptable way, in this transitional way, so we can have a peaceful elections in the next few weeks, in the next few months.
In the next few months?
Teymoor, I really have to say about this sense of we need stability to move towards the election. I find it very ironic. I find it absolutely disgusting for us to be talking about let's keep peace so we had election, because I was on your show last year when we were having the PDRC protesters on the streets, when Yingluck Shinawatra government dissolved the parliament, tried to push for the election, and we had these protesters on the streets trying to block the election. Of course, right then, we advocated for the use of certain legal measures to curb down those protesters. But the courts in Thailand said, well, you cannot intervene. And the military leaders, General Prayut himself back then said, well, I want to be fair to everyone. I don't want to do this and that. So I'm just going to send in the medics to take care of the protesters, but I'm not going to send anyone home. So I think it is an absolute hypocritical sense that we are talking about trying to create peace and move towards the election, whereas we had the opportunity to do that, but the military leaders at the time, who are now the junta leaders today, didn't seem to care. So I think basically it boils down to my point that I made earlier. This is not about the public security. This is not about what is good for the country. This is about the security of the junta. This is about the security of the authoritarian regime itself. And let me put this to you very clearly. We had incidents of people throwing bombs in front of the Court of Justice in Thailand. We had incidents of people installing grenades on the SkyTrain in the middle of Bangkok. I worry about that. But for those criminals, we need to arrest them and prosecute them. But there is no need to ban students from have peaceful political gathering. There is no cause for the junta to say if a newspaper criticizes and create some sort of criticism against the junta that they deem to be a confusion of information, then they could shut down newspapers or television stations. So at the end of the day, the question is, whose stability are we talking about? Are we talking about the peace and stability of the country? If that is the case, we should have done that when we had PDRC on the streets. But if it is about the security of General Prayut Chan-o-cha and his folks, then we have to accept the reality that this is not really about the public interest.
Dr. Panitan, it's a fair, strong argument, isn't it? You didn't imply those same arguments when there were people on the streets last year. And also, let me just add the point that has been made, which is a very strong point. If it was about simply peace and security on the streets, how do you explain the draconian measures being brought against the media and anyone who makes any kind of criticism? The General Prayut even, and he claims it was a joke now, he even threatened to execute journalists for saying things that he doesn't like. How does that lead us to a peaceful nation?
Well, everybody knows that that's a joke, but of course, whether or not a leader should make that kind of joke, it depends on your point of view. Of course, peace and stability, according to the Thai people, that is, according to the survey this year, this week, a few days ago, a majority of the Thai people, 70%, 80% supported the new measures used by Article 44. Unless you don't believe in these polls, of course, that's peaceability in the meanings of the Thai people, not you, not me, not Professor Virapat. We have to look at the real issues on the ground. That's number one. Number two, of course, you look at the media in Thailand in general. Of course, there are different professionalism in your country, in this country. But majority of the 600 satellite TVs in Thailand are still in operating. 6,000 community radios are still in operating. And many of them are broadcasting very, very strong messages against the government, against the military. I need to advise you to turn on to those radios. Pick up any newspapers in Thailand, front line, front page, full of criticisms against the military. None have been arrested. None has been closed down. Well, the reality is quite different from the written on the ground, written on in the rules. According to these realities, we need to come to terms with that. That Thailand is not still a normal country. We are still not a democratic country. But the Thai people, according to these surveys, prefer the situation this way for the time being.
All right. Well, we'll examine that claim in just a minute. We're going to have to take a short break. But the idea that perhaps the Thai people support what's going on is one positive. Are there any other upside to Article 44 and the new rules? We'll discuss that coming up after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, Thailand's Deputy Prime Minister, Priyathon Devakula, says the tourism industry has already seen positive changes after last week's cancellation of martial law. Now, apparently, tourists can buy travel insurance again because apparently insurance companies wouldn't cover trips to the country under martial law. So that's one upside. Are there any more? Let's get back to our guests, Dr. Panitan Watanayagon from Chulalongkorn University in London, Virapat Pariawong at the University of London. And Professor Virapat, let me start with you and the point that Dr. Panitan made before the break. The country supports what's going on and all the problems that we laid out in the first half are minor ones compared to the positive aspects if you look at the polls. How's your response to that?
Well, Dr. Panitan has very good knowledge of the poll numbers and he mentioned newspapers, radio stations. And I just have to bear you very basic numbers as well. Dozens and dozens of people are now being prosecuted in military courts. There are civilians. At least 2 television stations have just been terminated from broadcasting, and they are known as the red shirts or the anti-military regime television stations. So there are evidence out there that there are dissenters who don't agree with the regime, who wants to voice their concerns, but they can't. So I think at the end of the day, if we want to talk about what the public really think, we need to have freedom of expression, and it's not really useful for us to debate whether the polls reflect one way or the other, as long as we can't openly have discussions about it. And Teymoor, about your questions, whether this is a minor thing compared to the great advantages that the security is being offered to Thai people, I think we have to learn from the history. Let's look back at the 2006 coup, which produced the 2007 election, the 2007 constitution. Of course, there was a sense that because we had martial law put in place when we had this new election constitution back in 2007, we would have some sort of peace and security. But at the end of the day, we didn't. Under a demonstration opposite Wechachiwa, when he was the prime minister, we had serious incidents going on in Bangkok. 90 dead bodies on the streets of Bangkok. And is that because it's the fault of Kun Apisit or fault of the red shirts? I don't think it's anyone's fault. It's the fault of the whole system imposing this sense of retribution, this sense of injustice, this sense of pressure that is mounting over years. This is not something that is going to explode tomorrow or next week, but it's going to keep on imposing this sense of climate of fear and climate of pressure and repression on the people. And one day, once we have an election, it could explode again.
Dr. Panitan, it's a fair point, isn't it? In an environment where journalists and anybody who expresses a political opinion that General Prayuth doesn't like is getting arrested and being punished for doing so, you can't really trust a poll that goes out and asks them whether they're happy with things, can you? I mean, people in that environment are much more likely to say, yes, everything's fine, aren't they?
Well, you need to look at the real cases, 2 or 3 cases that Professor Virapat mentioned. These programs are provoking people to come out on the street fighting. The rest of the
we're not talking about fighting. We're talking about the journalists that are being arrested. We're talking about the journalists that are being arrested, the general mood in the country of people who are afraid to speak their minds because it's been told to them very explicitly that if they say anything that the military doesn't like, they will be punished.
Of course. There are some who are afraid, and I think that has to be taken into consideration. I think the military have to pay attention to that. But last year, we have more than 25 million visits from overseas to Thailand. Ask those 25 million visits also what the country is like under the coup. If the coup is so bad, why these 25 million visits? And that number seems to be increasing also. You need to take a look at different factors on the ground. I'm not saying that political freedom is not good. I'm not saying that in the end, fully democratic government is required. I think, but it is, of course, up to the Thai people. But of course, for the time being, you need to look at these real conditions. People who are throwing bombs in front of the court, they already confessed in his own words. I'm not so sure you can trust him, but in his own words, he said he would like to cause destructions as much as he can in order to return Thailand to democracy. I'm not so sure you should allow that. In many countries, for example, in France, you also have
sorry to interrupt, but I don't think
in 1958,
I don't think Professor Virapat was arguing that somebody throwing bombs should be allowed to do so. That wasn't the point. But let me just ask you one other question.
Exactly.
You've mentioned a few times the idea about moving towards democracy. You mentioned elections in a few months, which I'm sure was just a slip of the tongue. But to what extent can you give assurances that there will be elections at all? I mean, some people are saying there should even be a referendum over the proposed constitution, let alone elections. But will elections come by the time early next year that's been promised? Because again and again, the government and people in power tend to elide this question and tend to sort of try and brush it off. Can you give us some clarity on what the thinking is?
Yes. But before that, could you give us the answer if you see any derailment of the roadmap that being announced last year? Since the beginning of the announcement of the roadmap last May, is there any derail? Is there any, moving,
All right, well, let's put that to Professor Virapat. Put that to Professor Virapat. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, I think I have to make it clear to everyone again that if we have criminals who throw grenades in Bangkok, we need to arrest them and prosecute them. If we have someone who wants to incite violence, then there are laws. We don't need to rely on the martial law. We don't need to rely on Section 44. There are criminal laws, security laws already put in place to deal with those criminals. And let me just be very straight and frank to you. Those criminals, they are not going to go in the public and say, people, join me on the streets. They're going to do it in secret. They're going to do it at night. They're not going to write columns in newspapers. So the measures being put forward by Section 44 under Order number 3/2558, they are not aimed at curbing down the criminals. They are aimed at curbing down the citizens, the civilians who disagree with the coup.
Right.
So at the end of the day, like I said from the first break, this is not the security of the nation. This is for the security of Prayut and the military regime. And I'll get back to you, Teymoor, the questions concerning how do we move forward towards democracy, at the end of the day, we need tourists to come back in. We need to create good conditions for economy. I'm in total agreement with Ajahn Panitan on that.
We're running out of time. Dr. Panitan, his question was, have you seen any evidence that the move towards elections and democracy has been derailed?
Yes. Not yet.
I think this is a logical fact.
Hold on.
We hope that the timetable should be on track.
Let Professor Virapat answer that question. Have you seen any moves to derailment?
This question has a logical fallacy in itself, because the plan put forward by the military regime in the first place is illegitimate and wrong. How can you say, let's evaluate something that is wrong from the first place? So it doesn't really matter to me whether there's a derailment or not. What we have seen so many times in Thailand is that once you have the coup, you have a new constitution, you have an election, then you have violence. And it's a repetitive cycle, vicious cycle. So we need to break this cycle. And the only way to break this cycle is to restore the fundamental rights and freedom to the people. Let's have a peaceful, constructive and open dialogue where everyone can voice their concerns, and not to have the top-down approach by one general who can execute anyone who doesn't agree about him, whether that's joking or not.
And very quickly, one final question to you, Dr. Panitan.
I think that's imagination.
Let me just leave you with one final question, Dr. Panitan.
We are a very peaceful country. Yes.
You talk about derailment, which again is a little bit misleading, because that suggests that there is some kind of a really well-defined path to a certain process. That path is not very well defined. Can you tell us what exactly that path consists of right now?
Well, I think in the next few weeks, you are looking at the final draft of the Constitution, and then there is a decision to be made whether or not there should be a referendum on that Constitution. If not, then maybe a period of 60 days to 90 days has to be extended in the preparation of the referendum and in the preparation of the organic laws.
But will there be a general election within the next year?
Yes, that is committed still at this point. But it's up to the Assembly and the Reform Council to approve that.
Plenty of buts still to be worn through. Dr. Panitan Watanagon at Chulalongkorn University, thank you very much. And in London, Virapat Periawong at the University of London. Thank you both for being on the programme tonight. That's it for our programme today. Join us again on Wednesday on Between the Lines, where we'll talk about Nigeria's President-elect, Muhammadu Buhari. He's issued a defiant vow to take on the Boko Haram militants. Previous governments have been riddled with corruption and incompetence and haven't managed to defeat Boko Haram. Will that change under the new leader? We'll discuss that on Wednesday on Between the Lines. And I'll leave you, as always, with a look at our website and remind you that you can watch this show again online. Goodbye for now.